Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Angry Dave podcast. I'm Dave. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about mental health and particularly men's mental health. It's a more serious podcast today, but I had a conversation with Allah, which I just released recently, and he talked about athlete mental health and the difficulty that athletes have. And this also coincides with the 29th anniversary of my uncle, uh, Eddie, killing himself in my basement when I was 8 years old. That'll be June 2nd, 2023. I'm going to release this podcast on that date just to commemorate his death and to, as a reminder that mental health is still an enormous issue today, and suicide is still an issue, particularly rising rates in young men. And it doesn't seem to have been getting better. You know, my um, history with suicide and mental health issues is extensive. I was 8 years old and second grade, coming to the end of second grade, had a normal Friday, June 1st, 1984. I'm sure that I walked myself home from school that day, probably played some Atari with my Uncle John, who would be there at the end of the day and would be waiting for me with the key, and had a normal, probably evening that evening, watching TV with my dad. We usually got pizza on Fridays. And I don't even remember my uncle coming home that night. I believe I was there when he came home. My Uncle Eddie was living in our basement at the time, had like a little apartment, and he didn't show up to my communion. I had communion, we're Catholic. We had communion the weekend before. He didn't show up to the party or the communion, and he was my godfather, so it was a big deal. My dad was pissed off at him. They weren't really talking. Eddie hurried down into the basement. Everything was normal that night. The next thing that I know, or my next memory, is my aunt Christine and her husband at the time, Jimmy, waking me up, shaking me awake in the wee hours of the morning in early June 2nd of 1984 to tell me that my uncle was dead and that he shot himself in the basement. I have that memory pretty clear. I remember breaking out crying right away. I remember Uncle Jim just looked like he was shell shocked, and Christine was crying, and we were hugging. And then the only other thing I really remember about that night is hearing my grandmother scream. No, not my Eddie, not my, just screaming repeatedly, as I guess they were taking him out of the house. In my mind, I remember me seeing them take the body out. I know that my aunt didn't let me downstairs. I know that didn't happen, but I have internalized it as if I saw them taking him out of the house. I also know that I don't remember the cops questioning my father, but I remember the story, and I remember my dad being very upset that he was being questioned about his brother. My dad was sitting upstairs, sitting in the living room, when he heard a gunshot. Me and my sister, were upstairs sleeping, and we were on the second floor. My uncle was in the basement. The door was locked. My dad heard a shotgun go off. He screamed down to his brother. He had to rip the door off the hinges. He gets down to his brother as his brother's taking his last breath. He shot a hole in his chest. He put a pillow in the middle of his chest and shot. My dad would worry. My dad would contemplate for the rest of his life why he put the pillow in the middle of his chest. Was it to muffle the sound so, my sister and I didn't hear it? Was it because he really didn't want to kill himself? I mean, that answer, he would never know that answer. I know my uncle left a couple notes telling people that he loved them, but nothing really else. The weeks prior to him killing himself, he had been make hints, like hinting to different people, to his friends, to his maybe his brothers and sisters. I don't know if I'm going to be around for that much longer, that kind of thing. Nobody took it, as serious. He was 25 years old. He had a whole life to live. When the family talks about my uncle, and I don't have very many memories. I was only 8 years old at the time. But when they talk about him being like the cool dude. He was, the good-looking one of the good-looking ones of the family, or the good-looking one. Girls loved him. He always had a girlfriend. He had a lot of friends, you know. But the other side of that too is he had some mental health issues. He was doing some heavy drugs, and I guess he had been, back and forth with different jobs and not really, progressing the way he wanted to progress. But he never got any help. I mean, it's 1984. Certainly at that time, men didn't get help for depression or feeling bad about yourself. There was no mental health really for anybody back then, but certainly not for men. And in my house and my family, and in many families, men are taught to be strong, and by strong you mean physically strong. You want to be tough. Nobody's going to fuck with you. You would fight if somebody said the wrong thing to you. That's the way we were brought up. You wouldn't cry. You're not somebody who cries at anything that happens. You just deal with it and move on. You're stoic about it. There's no, that's you're being a pussy or you're a sissy. So nobody would say I'm feeling depressed. That's just not something that they would have did. My family was never the same after that. I can sit here and tell numerous stories about just times where I've seen my grandmother break down and cry and just the overwhelming sadness, or how my dad just never felt, just never felt the same. I mean, my dad never wasn't in a drinker or anything like that. He went on a little bit of binge after his brother died, but that was short lived. But he never sort of got his feet under him for really the rest of his life. My dad was 28 years old at the time when his brother died. He struggled. He would have dreams about him all the time, and we would talk about it quite often. My grandfather, towards the end of his life, told me that a few months after Eddie killed himself, he was down on the docks and had a 9 millimeter with him and thought about killing himself, put the 9 millimeter in his mouth and the figure over the trigger, and talked about how he touched the trigger. He didn't never squeezed it, but touched it and got that close to really just want to end his life. My grandfather was a tough dude, right? Physically tough. I, I saw him getting a fight when he was in his 70s with like a 25-year-old dude. I mean, got his ass kicked. Well, I didn't see it, but I heard about it. But anyway, I mean, he was a crazy old man, never afraid of a bar fight. But he never got any mental health treatment, and he definitely needed it. My grandfather never even really knew who his father was. His father left when he was early. He met his real father when he was like in his 30s. Felt unwanted most of his life. Would talk about that. Would talk about that his main dream in life was to create a family that at least his kids knew who he was. Right? So that just that basic level of family that he never had. I mean, he felt unwanted, unloved. We talked about it a lot. Even his mother, my grandfather was so bitter that he had an argument with his mother as an adult and didn't talk to her. for like the last 20 years of her life, I believe, something around that time. I know that she tried to come back around when Eddie passed away, but my grandfather wouldn't talk to her even then. Didn't go to her funeral, nothing. She had a house, and he gave it away to his sisters. So that anger, that resentment, stayed with him forever, and he never dealt with it. Never dealt with it. His way of dealing with it was going to the bar and drinking it away, and anger. I mean, really, he could be a very angry, disagreeable person, and he just never ever dealt with it. My father wasn't angry like that, but he was chronically depressed, lived in fear of failure for all of his life, a fear that really was sort of counterproductive, right? Because he feared so much that he would not try things and then just sort of guarantee the failure. I once had a conversation with my dad at a kitchen table when I was 15 years old. We were losing our house because my mom salary wasn't cutting it. He had two kids at home, and he was basically chronically unemployed. And I begged him to just get any job. I said, Dad, just any job. I said, McDonald's, something. $10 an hour would help us. Anything. And he said to me, David, I can't do that. I I think I talked about this in my first podcast, but that inability, that fear of looking badly or looking less than what he wanted people to perceive him to be, that outside influence of the way you view yourself. He struggled with it his whole life and was chronically depressed, smoked himself, and ate himself to death. I mean, he really did. That's the way he coped. Instead of getting help, he coped by eating and smoking. And he died at 55 years old because of it. And then he didn't off himself, but, I like to say, he took the express train to death. So, while he didn't put a gun in the middle of his chest, he certainly helped kill himself by not taking care of himself and doing things that he knew and everybody knew that were going to hurt him. And then there's my Uncle Mark. Mark was in his early 50s when he swallowed a bottle of pills and never woke up. Mark was, anybody that knew him loved him. He was the life of the party. If you were lucky enough to be in his circle, he was always kind, always had a kind word, never judgmental, always was a person that could meet you where you needed to be meet, to give you advice, to give that love that you needed. He just was never good at giving it to himself. Mark had lots of dreams as a young man, and I guess he lived out some of them, but he was in a place where he had to come back home, and he just never succeeded in the way he wanted to succeed, and he struggled, and he struggled. He was sick a few times and wouldn't take his medication, and was like trying to sort of like off himself that way. That didn't work because he was too healthy, so he eventually just swallowed a bottle of pills. But again, that shame, that disappointment, that depression, he let it eat at him until he couldn't take it anymore. And I guess that's probably what Eddie did too, right? It's the shame and depression and just living in it and never getting any help. My dad did the same thing, and his father the same way. They lived, longer lives. My dad only lived until he was 55. Mark was, I guess, 51, around there, 51 or 52. And my grandfather lived almost till 81. He was 80. So I guess he lived the only full life. And towards the end of my grandfather's life, he was so, sad, so sad. He had just seen my dad predeceased him. Mark was still fine, but at that point he had lost his wife. He had lost three kids, and one was a Sid's baby, and then yeah, my dad from lung cancer, my uncle from suicide, and his wife. He lost his wife too. He was just so sad and done with life. And I guess I get that to some degree, but my point with him is he lived a lot of life and put off a lot of negative energy because of that feeling of not being wanted and not knowing how to love people, not knowing mostly how to love himself. It just brings me to the point, in my own life, I call this the Angry Dave podcast, but why am I so angry? Because of all of that stuff, because of that history and of personal feeling of feeling, less than others or not good enough. And then the way of coping with it would be to lash out. You're not going to treat me about the way that I feel about myself inside, right? That's the way I dealt with it, certainly early on in my life, and have struggled with that anger for most of my life. Feeling too short, too chubby, too poor, you're not smart enough, not good enough. And the way I dealt with it most of the time is eating. I'm a depressed eater, and also from anger, just lashing out to stop it from other people giving it to me when really, really it has nothing to do with anybody outside. It's really just the way I'm feeling inside, and they're putting a mirror on me. I don't like it. And I've seen, that self-doubt, and I've seen that fear, and I've talked about the fear that I've had of failure and the fear of being my father, which, has in a lot of ways helped me because I didn't want to be so fearful that I would be, not try things and be unsuccessful just because of the fear of doing anything. But then I see other people being crippled by especially men, by the expectations of their parents, the expectations of others, what they feel that they should have accomplished, what they put on themselves to accomplish, and when they fall anywhere short of that, they get depressed and they feel sad about themselves. And maybe it doesn't lead to suicide, but it leads to a life of depression and unhappiness, and that permeates throughout your relationships and to your children, and you pass that stuff down, and it's a big cycle that really we need to stop it. We need to stop it. We need to stop putting our expectations on each other. We need to stop putting those expectations on ourselves, and we need to stop that cycle for our children and our grandchildren. I've seen others like me that have fear of failure, or not just the fear of failure, but the lack of self-concept, right? Or self-worth. There's self-esteem, and then there's, or self-respect and self-worth, which I define as two different things. Like the self-respect is I'm not going to let anybody disrespect me, right? I want people to treat me well when they see me, that type of thing. But self-concept or self-worth is different. It's how you view yourself in the world. And I see quite often, and I've done it myself in my life, is, I've come far from where I came from. I should be happy with the education that I have and the life that I've been able to provide for my kids. And maybe that should satisfy me. But what if it doesn't? What I don't owe Temple University anything for giving me an education. I don't owe any employer for giving me that job. I've earned all of that. And I've also earned the right to not want to do it anymore. Or I have earned the right to be unhappy and say that I'm unhappy, or that I'm unsatisfied and say that I'm unsatisfied and move on with my life. The only The only people that I owe anything to would be my wife and my kids. But you owe those people, you would give them more by being happy and content than an extra couple bucks in your bank account. I just want to say that we need to take care of our health. Like, and men out there that are listening, we need to take care of yourself, both physically too, but mentally. Go and get help. It's okay to be not okay. You don't have to wallow in it. You aren't a failure because you feel like shit. You aren't a failure because this thing that you worked for doesn't satisfy you. It's okay. What's not okay is letting yourself wallow in in that depression and that anxiety forever. It doesn't make sense to do it. You can get help. There is help. There is light on the other side. You don't have to keep being this way. It isn't strength. It isn't strength to just move on to the next day and be miserable, to move on to the next day and feel bad about yourself, to move on to the next day and be disappointed in yourself. You don't have to do that. All of that is an external thing that's coming from outside that you're letting in. If you're 15 years old and you're feeling sad about yourself and you're feeling like you don't have any friends or nobody likes you, I just want to say that you're not alone, that a lot of us at 15 years old felt shitty, and it's temporary. And go get help and go say something to somebody that happiness is attainable for you. If you're 25 years old and you're in your career or you don't have a career and you feel like, you haven't gotten started yet, you have three quarters or two-thirds of a life to live. There's plenty of time, plenty of time. Getting on a slow start doesn't mean a slow ending. Again, just go get help. If you're 35 years old and you don't feel like you made your mark yet, change jobs. Go get help. Talk to somebody. And if you're 45 like me and you decided that it's just not for you anymore, whatever you're doing in life, or despite any success that you had, it still doesn't feel like enough for you, then change jobs. Change the way what you're doing. But mostly you have to change the way you think about yourself. And you have to give yourself some leeway. I guess probably more than anything, I want to tell men to just be kind to yourselves. It's normal to be sad. It's normal not to be happy about everything. And you may have been sad and you may be depressed for a long time, and you're going to need help to get out of it. And medication isn't always the answer. You need to go talk to somebody and acknowledge that you feel this way and that and that you can't do it alone. Again, you have a sports injury, you hurt your knee, you go to an orthopedic surgeon. If you hurt your heart or your mind is hurting, you have to go to a psychologist and psychiatrist. That's why they're there. That's why it exists. It's not fake. It's not fake. And you're not going to bootstrap your way out of depression. I've seen it happen too many times. Even the people that didn't kill themselves just wallow in that depression and that anger and that anxiety and that frustration for years and years and years. And then they just can't get out of it. And they're still talking and still feeling the same way they did from 20 years ago. And then you alienate everybody, and then you just become siloed, because that's what depression does to you. It wants to push everybody away. Don't do it. You don't have to do it anymore. It doesn't make you stronger. It doesn't make you stronger to wallow in that depression. Those voices that you're hearing, that you're not worth it, or that you're not good enough, or that you didn't do well enough, you're not adequate. Again, those are voices that you from learned behavior, from people outside of that outside influence, and you allowing, as Stephanie would say, people to be in your mind rent free. No more of that. You don't need to do it. You don't need to be perfect. None of us are perfect. And you're allowing all that outside influence to influence how you feel about yourself. And we all do it. Especially today, men today. Men today, it's not the 1950s anymore. We don't have to just be a provider. We have to be a provider. We have to be the best dad in the world. We have to be the best husband in the world. We have to be socially conscious. We have to be everything. Maybe women feel like this is a little bit of self pity because women have always had to be a little bit of everything. Women never had to deal with the feeling that love for you is transaction. And what I mean by that is that the value of men in our society is what they provide to the family. It's never just because you exist. We treat Mother's Day dramatically different than we treat Father's Day in our society. Once a man stops giving something, then he becomes unnecessary. Mothers aren't treated that way. Children aren't treated that way. Dads and men are treated that way. And it just compounds the issue of we have to be we're asked to be everything all the time. And when we don't attain all that and we put all that pressure on ourselves, it's easy to become depressed or to become disappointed in our lives because, we're none of us are perfect and we can't be the perfect husband, the perfect dad, the perfect employee. We can't. There's no time. We're not giving ourselves any time to actually live in our mind and to deal with those issues. The other thing that I just wanted to say is we need, as men, need to learn to love ourselves like we love the other people in our lives. Think about that person that you love so much that you miss. For me, like my grandmother was everything to me, everything. But she wasn't perfect, right? And I didn't care that she wasn't perfect. I would still have died for her or my kids. I love them unconditionally. I would do anything for them, go to jail for them, die for them, kill for them. Why do we not do that for ourselves? That's what I want to tell you all, is to start loving yourselves like you love those in your life. If you do that, this goes away. You would tell somebody in your life that was struggling to go get help, that had a knee injury to go to the doctors, that was feeling bad about themselves to go talk to a psychologist or psychiatrist. You would tell them that because you love them. So do it for yourself. That's all I have for now. I'll try not to be so serious next time. But, just this mental health thing. Lost too many people. Seen too many people just struggle. And we just need to be better to ourselves, more forgiving to ourselves, and allow ourselves to actually seek the happiness that we want. Because it's there if you want it. You just need to let yourself go there and stop apologizing for who you are. Stop apologizing for who you are. And particularly stop apologizing to yourself for who you are. It's okay. Stop living in the past. Stop living with other people's problems or other people's, view on life. It's okay to be you. It's okay to be dysfunctional. It's okay to be not fine sometimes. It's okay to be sad. It's not okay to live in it forever. It's not okay to give up because you don't want to feel that bad anymore. I get it. Nobody wants to feel bad, but there's help. You can go get the help. You can allow yourself to be happy. You really can. You really can. So please, for 8-year-old me who had to wake up still to this day, hear his grandmother screaming, to my dad who had to pick up his brother who shot a hole in his chest and had to live with that for the rest of his life, to my grandfather who had to deal with the fact that he felt responsible for his son's suicide for the rest of his life. For the rest of my family, who it still pains them 39 years later, 39 years later, and it still affects us all. You don't have to be the next person. You don't have to be the next Eddie Magaldi who gave his 2/3 of his life away for temporary pain. You don't have to be it. You don't have to be Mark Magaldi, who gave about a third of his life away for temporary pain because he wouldn't go get help, because he was too depressed, because he was disappointed in the way the 2/3 of his life, or the way his life was currently. Tomorrow's another day. Get through today, get to tomorrow, and get some help. People love you. People love you. But you need to start loving yourself. So go do it. All right? Love you all. I'm out. Peace.